Is the God of the Bible morally good? If you were to walk up to any random Christian in the streets and ask them this question, they'll most likely answer you, of course. God is the definition of good. Everything he does is perfect. And when you present Christians with certain biblical stories that describe the God of the Bible as someone who commands, the average Christian would just kinda shrug and offer some rationale as to why things were different back then, and how these stories of the Old Testament do not in any way mean God is not perfect. And no Christian is better at creating excuses than the apologist, one whose very job is to defend the Christian faith against all criticism. Since I left the Jehovah's Witness religion 2 years ago, I have watched hundreds of hours of Christian apologetics because I find this field incredibly fascinating. Today, we are going to observe how 3 Christian apologists attempt to reconcile the violent stories of the Old Testament with their belief in an all-loving God. And I will offer my commentary on why these explanations are not only insufficient, but also inherently dishonest. Thank you for joining me. This is your host, Panda. The first verse commanding a complete destruction of the Canaanites can be found in Deuteronomy 7, where Yahweh commands the Israelites to take possession of the promised land and totally destroy the current inhabitants in it. The Israelites were to make no treaty with them, no marriage alliance, and they were commanded to destroy any object related to the worship of foreign gods. This call for destruction is repeated again in Deuteronomy 20, known as the Rules of War chapter. In case the Israelites declare war on a city that is not in the promised land, they are to give a peace offering to the city. If the people accept the offer, they are to become slaves to the Israelites. If they refuse the offer, all of the men of the city will be slaughtered, and the rest of the people, women, children, and livestock, will be taken as plunder by the Israelites. But these rules only apply to cities outside Canaan. In the case of Canaanite cities, Yahweh commands the Israelites to destroy them and not leave alive anything that breathes. The instructions are clear. Anything that breathes includes not only fighting men, but also the elderly, the women, the infants, and in some cases, even the livestock. A complete extermination. There is no ambiguity in the text. This is a divinely inspired destruction. The book of Joshua gives several examples of this divine command being carried out. When Israel marches around Jericho and the city walls collapse, the whole city is slaughtered, with the exception of Rahab and her family. When Joshua's army burns down the city of Ai, everyone inside is slaughtered, and the soldiers take the livestock for themselves. These conquest episodes continue into the book of Judges, with more God-sanctioned genocide at the hands of characters like Jephthah and Samson. But I think you get the issue by now. How could a loving God order such horrific exterminations? How could the killing of innocent Canaanite children ever be justified? Let's see how Christians try to answer these questions. Let's start with Frank Turek, one of the most popular Christian apologists.
That God said everybody should die. Can God do that? Here's my question. Is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? When somebody dies, does God murder them? No, God can't murder anyone because he's the creator of life. So when he takes life, that's up to him. He can resurrect life. We can't do that, so we don't have the authority to take innocent human beings' lives. But God does. So if God wants to take somebody's life, he can, if he has a reason for it. He might explain the reason, he might not. But he has the authority to do that. In fact, if Christianity is true, people don't really die, they just change location, right? They move from one life to the next life. So God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. God can do that, we can't. Now, one more thing on this, and Copan goes into a lot more detail than I'm doing here, but one more detail on this I think we need to recognize. The Old Testament theocracy was unique and temporary. It was not the ideal for all time, but the means to a promised new covenant. God wanted to get the promised people in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah to be a blessing to the whole world. And if he gave 400 years of warnings to the Canaanites who were doing these detestable practices and they wouldn't stop, his only choice at that point, with free creatures, was to use force to push them out or to drive them out. And that's apparently what he did.
This kind of rationale that Frank is using hits really close to home. I remember when I was a believer and wanted to reconcile the conquest of Canaan with a loving God, I would also employ the same excuses. This conquest was necessary for the fulfillment of God's promise. Without a promised land, there is no Messiah and no salvation of humanity. Frank also claims that God only had one possible way to deal with the Canaanites at that point.
His only choice at that point, with free creatures, was to use force to push them out or to drive them out.
Isn't God all-powerful and all-knowing? Was extermination the only solution? Couldn't he figure out a way to drive the Canaanites away without the need to slaughter children? This apologist doesn't think so. Also notice how skilled Frank is in using language.
Was to use force to push them out or to drive them out.
Yahweh did not command the Israelites to push the Canaanites out, like Frank tries to put it. This was cold metal against a soft throat. This was utter extermination. Another way Christians rationalize these stories is by saying that God is the author of life, so he has the right to take away the life of anyone he wishes. But that was never the issue in question. The question is not whether God has the right to kill children, but rather whether his killing of children was morally justified.
Now, God can do that. We can, but God can. So, the Old Testament is, as I say here, temporary, and it was never meant to be the ideal law for all time. In fact, everything from Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, all the way through Deuteronomy does not apply to Christians. You know the Ten Commandments don't apply to Christians? Did you know that? Only if they're repeated in the New Testament, and 9 out of the 10 are. The only one that's not repeated is keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Because who's the Sabbath? Jesus. He's already arrived. The Sabbath is our rest. But unless something's repeated and renewed in the New Testament, it's not applicable to Christians today.
That doesn't matter. Even if the Old Testament laws are not to be followed by Christians today, you still claim they were provided by God. So these laws are a reflection of who God is, and things are not looking too bright so far. The next apologist we'll be watching is Dr. Theodore Cabell, professor of apologetics at the Southern Seminary. Mr. Cabell is more soft-spoken than the obnoxiously loud Frank Turek, but at least he will try to directly tackle the question. Why did God command the Old Testament killing of women and children?
I think it is shocking, and I think we're supposed to feel the weight of it. The second thing that makes it so difficult, unlike, let's say, a so-called act of God, a tornado or an earthquake that kills women and children, is that in this case, God commands his people to be his agents of extermination. And the shocking thing about that is that his people, they are sinful themselves. There is the difficult side that we look at, but if we are to be honest with the Bible, we have to take a look at what else the Bible teaches us that is really the other side of the coin. First of all, comes up at the very heart of this question is this ethically just? Is it even right because of these women and children? Well, not everyone will accept this answer, and I myself, before I was a Christian, would have hated this answer.
I appreciate this man's honesty. Truly I do. But this is a blatant admission that the argument he is about to present is so insufficient, it will only convince current believers. That is not a good way to start an argument.
The answer is that God alone is a righteous judge. Will the God of all the earth judge righteously? You may not, or maybe I might not, see how, reading the Bible, reading the story of life around me, how God can be just and allow these things to happen. I think there's a biblical teaching that I hope I can show at least some of the reasons why we should trust that God really is just in the way he does these things. But fundamentally, what the Bible teaches us is that God is just whether we completely understand how. And that for us to assume that He is somehow unjust is in fact to assume that we know more about things than we really do. We don't know everything. So God alone is in a place of righteousness where He can pronounce these judgments. That's important fundamentally as part of the answer to this problem.
Christian apologists constantly use this line of reasoning. God is the perfect judge, and calling God unfair means we think we know more than Him. This is a perfect cop-out, and it shields God from any valid criticism you might throw at Him. Shouldn't we judge a person by their actions instead of by their titles? If my mother tells you that I'm the most loving person in the world, but you see me commit atrocities and war crimes, then you would know I'm full of BS. If we are to determine if God is a fair judge, we should look at His actions, right? But what apologists do is start with a conclusion. That is, God is a perfect judge, and then interpret all His actions through that lens. This makes no sense. Imagine if we did the same thing with Muhammad, the final prophet of Islam. For example, Muslims believe Muhammad is the best human example one could follow. Would you simply take their word for it? Or would you judge Muhammad based on his actions? What if you read in the Quran and the Hadiths that Muhammad was a ruthless warlord and that he married a girl as young as 9 years old? How would you judge his character? By his title or by his actions? If we apply the same scrutiny to Yahweh, things start to fall apart very quickly. That is why apologists always make an exception with God, without a valid reason to do so. They have to appeal to the Bible to make their case, instead of, appealing to the innate sense of morality we all share. We call this circular reasoning. The Bible is true because the Bible says so. Muhammad is the best example to follow because the Quran says so. It's quite a weak argument, isn't it? It's a terrible way to make your case. That's why Mr. Cabal already acknowledged that this argument is not going to work with unbelievers. When he says God is a perfect judge, he just wants you to take his word for it, and sadly, most believers will.
Second, we need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the Bible highlights this as a very important event in God's rescue plan for the human race, and more on that shortly. But in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
Sure, adults can be morally degraded, but babies can't. They haven't learned the complex moral code yet.
We know this not only from biblical descriptions of what the Canaanite people were like, but from archaeology. And the sorts of horrific sacrificial practices is just one example of offering their children to gods in very painful sorts of deaths. In fact, the Bible shows that God's judgment on the Canaanites was held back. He predicts it 400 years before it happens in the book of Genesis in chapter 15, and describes it as he's waiting until the sin of the Canaanite people is full. A very interesting theological concept, but again, it's not arbitrary. The measure of their degradation was full.
Oof. This verse in Genesis opens up a whole can of worms which we don't even have time to get into, but it does show that God had already condemned thousands of Canaanites which weren't even born yet. Not really a strong case for a perfect judge, is it?
And this leads then to a very important point I already alluded to. God, beginning with Abraham, has a mission to rescue a sinful human people. And it involves fallible and sinful agents like Abraham all the way to the present with people like me. And one of the things that's clear in this extermination is that God warns that the very people, by that time a whole nation, would be corrupted by the Canaanites if, in fact, they are allowed to remain. One of the interesting things that's often mentioned when people stumble over this question is that, in fact, the Bible makes clear that the Canaanites were never fully exterminated, number one, and number two, exactly what God says happened.
They were not fully exterminated because the Israelites failed at their jobs, not because God showed them some type of compassion. When King Saul failed to exterminate every single Amalekite in a war campaign, Yahweh was so furious he rejected Saul as king.
Indeed, throughout the Old Testament, the major problem is that over and over again, the people of God mix the worship of God the Creator, the one true God, with Baal or some other version of Canaanite religion. So the judgment was not only righteous, it was part of a necessary attempt to protect the very people of God he would use as part of his mission.
So again, Mr. Cabo repeats the same rationale that we heard from Frank. The extermination of the Canaanites was a necessary part of the fulfillment of God's purpose, because we needed a Messiah. Sure, okay. And God's judgment was fair because the Canaanites had been practicing child sacrifice for 400 years. Okay, sounds good. If that's the case, then why not spare the children? If this extermination is justified because the Canaanite adults were practicing horrible things, why did God also destroy the babies along with the adults? Will Mr. Cabo actually answer the question?
In the book of Joshua, with God's rescue of a prostitute Canaanite, Rahab, because she seeks the God, the one true God, she is spared, and her family. Not only is she spared, she will become the grandmother of King David and will end up in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. She stands out, in fact, she's mentioned in the book of James, the book of Hebrews. She stands out as a kind of hero of the faith. It's a foreshadowing of the very, and there are many others in the Bible. This one just gets our attention, but there are many of these kinds of judgments, and they are all around us to this day, that we are supposed to be forewarned by. And no one gives us a greater warning of the dangers of the life to come in an unredeemed state than Jesus Christ himself. Jesus had more to say about the pending judgment, yet he himself was the very one who gave himself a sacrifice that those who believe in him might be saved. So this is the amazing grace, the other side of judgment that we see in the unique story that's the Bible. And I think if we think of it in the bigger picture in the light of Jesus' teachings, then I think we actually see it for what it is. It is a merciful warning.
Nope, he never actually answered the question. God might have spared Rahab the prostitute because she put faith in him, but all those Canaanite babies had no way of putting faith in the God of Israel. Yet they were condemned because of the sins of their parents and sentenced to death. All Mr. Cabo is able to do when confronted with these horrific passages is to say we shouldn't judge God because we're not him, and to start speaking about Jesus. Because I guess God coming in the flesh to save humanity just kind of justifies all the slaughter he committed in the past, right? As I mentioned before, Mr. Cabo already came to the discussion with a predetermined conclusion. I am willing to admit some of Yahweh's actions in the Old Testament are morally good, like that time he provided the Israelites with bread from heaven, or when he used Elijah to resurrect the widow's son. On the other hand, apologists are never willing to admit that their God did something wrong. So no matter the amount of evidence against the contrary, apologists are never willing to admit they were wrong. The whole premise of apologetics is based on defending a pre-established creed, no matter what argument is thrown against it. How is this honest discourse? What's the point in debating with people who are never willing to admit that they're wrong? Now let's give the apologist one more chance. This last person we will listen to is a bit less known. This is Reese, an ex-Muslim from Algeria that converted to Christianity. Most of Reese's videos consist of exposing the fallacies of Islam while upholding Bible truths. Okay. And he has this fascinating video on why God ordered the destruction of the Amorites. Please, Reese, please give us some better reasons than Turek and Cabal did. I'll spare you the first 6 minutes of the video since they consist of Mr. Reese describing an archaeological site attributed to the Amorites. In this site there were several jars containing the remains of small girls that met violent deaths as they were sacrificed to the Canaanite gods. I think we can all agree on this, that these practices were horrific and unjustifiable, right? The ritual killing of babies and infants is morally abhorrent. We can all agree on this.
Being descendants of the Canaanites, the Amorite people worshipped Moloch as one of their many gods. The way in which this god was worshipped was primarily through child sacrifice, offered by fire. God waited hundreds of years for the Amorites to repent of their sin, but that day never came. What did come, however, was God's righteous judgment upon these Canaanite people. In Exodus 23, God refers directly to the Amorites by saying, "For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, so that you may live there. And I will destroy them completely. You must not worship the gods of these nations or serve them in any way or imitate their evil practices. Instead, you must utterly destroy them and smash their sacred pillars." Was it really justified for God to do this? A non-Christian might argue that it was not just for God to do this because the Amorites did not have his law like the Israelites did. They didn't know any better because God didn't specifically instruct them not to do these sorts of things. But how can that possibly be a good argument when even the Gentiles, who do not have God's written law, show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it even without having heard it? They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them that they are doing right. Did the Amorites know that what they were doing was wrong? Of course they did. Even the atheists, who argue there is no God, claim to know the difference between right and wrong through their conscience alone. And if the atheists can agree that the practices of the Amorites were indeed evil, then how can we call God unjust for punishing that evil?
Again, I am not calling God unjust for punishing the evil adults. I am calling God unjust because he also punished innocent children. Reese, are you even going to mention the infants?
God is just, and everyone is without excuse. This stuff is real. These things actually happened.
Yep. No one questioned that human sacrifice in the ancient Near East was widespread. I think it's very common knowledge by now, Mr. Reese.
And the evidence is buried right beneath the soil that we walk on. I'm speaking for myself first when I say that we are all guilty of the sin of the Amorites through the way in which we have practiced idolatry ourselves.
No, we are not all guilty of the sin of the Amorites. Reese, the sin of the Amorites was the ritual killing of children. Bowing down before a wooden image is not the same as killing an infant. I think we can all agree on this, right?
Abortion, pornography, money, material possessions, relationships, our health, our physical appearance. At one point, we have all made a sacrifice to these idols. But the God of the Bible doesn't require a sacrifice from us. He has already made the sacrifice for us on the cross.
What did I tell you? Apologists always start talking about Jesus when they're faced with these difficult passages. Mr. Reese, unfortunately, did not address my question. In fact, none of these apologists actually addressed the question. And believe me, I looked. I watched dozens of apologetic videos looking for someone, one person, who might answer the question, why did God need to kill the Canaanite children? And every single apologist danced around the subject, attempted to justify the whole thing by saying we shouldn't judge God, and when all resources were spent, they all resorted to talking about Jesus, because talking about Jesus feels nice inside, doesn't it? I don't know about you guys, but I don't think the best way for God to punish the ritual sacrifice of infants is to kill more infants. That does not reflect the mind of an all-loving God. It reflects the mind of a Bronze Age tribal chief. Now notice what happens when a Christian apologist tries to directly answer the question.
Simple, right? Well, to my amazement and amusement, these questions immediately short-circuited his brain.
Well, I mean, obviously not. God chose to use those devices to display his glory and accomplish his goals. So could God? I mean, I don't know. You'll have to ask him yourself. But what he chose to do, the best way for him to do that in our fallen state, recognizing that sin and death, like even the fact that those things are in the equation as a result of man's sin, not God's original perfect garden, recognizing that we bear some responsibility in sin and death and atrocities, God clearly decided that this was the best way to accomplish his goals, whatever his goals were at those times. So no, God couldn't do that. Maybe he couldn't, but he chose to do it this way.
Okay.
My dude's brain was about to explode. What a shameful response. Do you know why everyone tries to avoid this question? Because there is no way to justify God's actions. In any other context, the order to kill children is evil. When Hitler does it, we call it evil. When Herod the Great does it, Christians call it evil. But when Yahweh does it, all of a sudden it's not only fine, it's perfectly justified. Because he's God. And I may have bought that excuse when I was an indoctrinated Jehovah's Witness, but I don't buy it anymore. The crimes of Yahweh are recorded in the Old Testament for all of us to judge. The Great Flood, the destruction of the firstborns of Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, all clear as day. But apologists refuse to see a problem with this because they're not in the business of defending a consistent moral code. They're in the business of defending a literary character. Apologists not only defend ethnic cleansing, they also defend biblical slavery, the horrific teaching of eternal torment, and the biblical hatred towards homosexuals. It really looks like a miserable job to me. You know what's one of my favorite parts of leaving Christianity? I no longer feel pressured to defend the God of the Bible. I no longer have to stand by a blood-soaked text and pretend it's all good. But hey, if you want to embrace the God of the Bible with all his flaws and moral shortcomings, that's perfectly fine by me. But when you put your face on the internet and start defending the undefensible, I'm sorry, but someone's gonna call your BS. I know this was a very different video from my usual Watchtower rebuttals, but sometimes you have to take a break from reviewing Watchtower propaganda so you can review other Christian propaganda. Let me know if you enjoyed the video, guys. I want to hear your opinion. Huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for their constant support. I am forever grateful to you. And don't worry, there will be more Uncle Tony videos in the future. Take it easy, guys. Have a wonderful day and stay away from God-sanctioned ethnic cleansings.